All right, Evan, take it away.
Thanks, Taylor. Good afternoon, everyone. It's 12:01, so let's go ahead and get started. So thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for our virtual event, Preserving Los Angeles, a conversation with Ken Bernstein. My name is Evan Bew, and I'm the engagement coordinator here at Historic Seattle. And today we have, I think, a really fantastic conversation with some really truly influential people in the preservation field. We're going to be hearing from the person who oversees the second largest municipal historic preservation program in the nation and who wrote the book about historic preservation in Los Angeles. And spoiler alert, this is Ken. We're also going to hear from local powerhouse voices in the field of historic preservation, our very own Seattle Historic Preservation Officer, Sarah Sodt, and the advocacy team here at Historic Seattle in Eugenia Wu and Jeff Murdock. But before we begin, and also speaking of Historic Seattle, for those who aren't familiar with us, our mission is saving meaningful places to foster lively communities. And Historic Seattle knows that our properties and programs occupy the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples. This acknowledgement is not a substitute for developing relationships with Indigenous communities or for honoring Indigenous stories as we share our collective history, but is the first step in recognizing the people whose land we occupy. And before I turn over the floor to our speakers, just a few housekeeping items. First, if you'd like to access closed captions, turn them on or off. There are three little buttons, a little symbol. Click that, you'll see a captions button. That's how you toggle on and off captions. Also, we'll be having an open Q&A at the end of our program. If you have questions, feel free to write them in the chat box of the Zoom meeting. And with that, I want to thank our sponsors for making our education programming possible. Thank you so much to Heritage Realty, Northwest Vernacular, Selland Construction, and Urban Villages. And then I also want to thank and acknowledge all of my Historic Seattle colleagues. Your collective efforts make today's and frankly, all Historic Seattle programs possible. And with that, finally, thank you to our whole team of speakers who have joined us today. We're really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Ken, Sarah, Eugenia, Jeff, and everyone in Angel City Press. Again, thank you for making this happen. And with that, Ken, I will pass it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Evan, for the invitation, and thank you to Historic Seattle for making this possible. It's a real pleasure to be joining all of you today to speak about my book, Preserving Los Angeles, but really to have a conversation with all of you about the power of historic preservation in America's cities. And you know, I have to say, in speaking to Seattle, when I've been to Seattle in the past, I know that there is often a feeling, perhaps, about Los Angeles, that Los Angeles is the kind of city that Seattle residents don't want to emulate. So I hope there's an openness to look at Los Angeles perhaps a little bit differently. And that's really the reason I wrote my book, because I think while many, even some in Los Angeles, but certainly in places like Seattle or some of our friends in San Francisco, New York, and other cities, the impression is that Los Angeles is a city of undifferentiated sprawl, perhaps, which you know, does not have an ethic around historic preservation, about preserving and revitalizing historic places. But I really felt that we did have a story to tell in Los Angeles to other Angelinos about what we've done around historic preservation. But I had hoped that the book would spark conversations like this in other cities about the role that historic preservation can play in local planning efforts and in revitalizing communities. So it's really a pleasure to be joining you today to talk about that. So I, as was mentioned, oversee the Historic Preservation Office, the Office of Historic Resources for the City of Los Angeles. And it really has given me kind of a bird's eye view about the role, the power of historic preservation. And what I've seen is that while historic preservation is frequently perceived as being about stopping change or blocking progress, in fact, in Los Angeles, preservation has been a primary engine for positive change. It's been a leading tool for revitalizing our downtown, our historic buildings, through adaptive reuse, converting historic buildings to new uses, in transforming neighborhoods and creating economic regeneration across the city. And even, I know we'll talk more about this today, even in addressing our housing crisis and our continued affordable housing challenges. And we've been working very hard to make sure that our preservation program in Los Angeles also more fully reflects all of the stories and experiences of our diverse communities in the city, and trying to point the way toward a more inclusive model of historic preservation and historic preservation planning. And that's really the story I wanted to tell through Preserving Los Angeles. This has been a labor of love for me. It was kind of a side project while maintaining my city duties over about a 2-year period to put the book together. And in that spirit, I've been donating my proceeds from the book to 3 nonprofit organizations that are working toward greater equity and inclusion in the historic preservation field. This is also a kind of a coffee table book format, richly illustrated with over 300 photos. And my partner in this effort was the architectural photographer, Stephen Schaefer, who is a preservationist in his own right in California, active in his home community in Ventura, and active with the California Preservation Foundation, our statewide nonprofit. And he's known as Schaefer around California. He shot over 19,000 photos that were distilled down to the 300 or so that we used for the book. And this is Schaefer on his SUV overlooking the LA basin. And the shot that he got, the back of the Hollywood sign, the iconic Hollywood sign that most of you I'm sure would know, looking over LA. So it was a pleasure to work with Schaefer as a partner to make this possible. But the main message of the book really is that I think developers and property owners alike, residents, are finding that historic preservation and adaptive reuse add economic value in our city. And Angelenos are seeking out places and buildings that have the unique history and beauty and authenticity of our historic buildings as their preferred places to live and work. And I think it's now fair to say in Los Angeles, and as it's long been true in many other cities, that the most vibrant places in the city, the most active real estate markets, the places with the highest concentration of activity, are those that have the highest concentrations of historic resources, as people are seeking the uniqueness, the beauty and authenticity that only our historic spaces can provide. And I've really tried to provide many examples in the book of how that is the case. Our historic preservation story really has to start with the power of historic designation, our local landmark designation process in Los Angeles, as well as the creation of historic districts. In Los Angeles, we have over 1,200 city historic cultural monuments or local landmarks. We show many in the book. Just wanted to kind of start with this one today and kind of illustrating some of the themes I know we'll talk more about in the Q&A about housing and historic buildings. This is a mid-century garden apartment complex called Chase Knolls in the San Fernando Valley community of Sherman Oaks that was rescued from demolition as a result of an 11th hour save with historic designation. And it's a complex influenced very much by the Garden City movement of planning and urban design, that you have the kind of the super block development, but richly landscaped pathways and courtyards, public and semi-public spaces that are shared by the community. And this was threatened with demolition. Tenants were being evicted. It's about a 260 unit complex. And it was historic designation that saved this place. The outcome of that designation was in doubt, even on the city council floor as this was being considered. And it's an example of how historic preservation not only saves buildings, but can preserve community. Because when you step on Chase Knolls property, you immediately feel that this is a very special place where the neighbors, unlike most multifamily complexes in LA and elsewhere, these neighbors know one another, they socialize and gather in the common spaces, and that preservation really has preserved not only the buildings, but a residential community. And it also has preserved what we often call naturally occurring affordable housing. In Los Angeles, buildings constructed before 1978 are covered by our rent stabilization law. And this preservation effort allowed preservation of housing at a lower price point, and also later enabled an addition to this complex of 141 new units in 6 new buildings, sensitively inserted where there had been carports previously to allow for the continued evolution of this site. But our historic designation program also is about inclusion, and again, telling all of the stories of our many communities. And wanted to share this one, which is the Black Cat bar in our community of Silver Lake, which kind of speaks to Los Angeles as a preservation pioneer. Our preservation ordinance goes back, as I said, to 1962. It predated New York, which had its landmarks law in 1965, and most other cities which came later than LA. And one thing that's interesting about our preservation laws, it allows for the designation of what we call our local landmarks, are actually called historic cultural monuments. And I think reflecting that this is not only about architecture, it's about history, it's about preserving our cultural heritage. And the Black Cat was a signature site in the gay rights movement nationally. We often think of Stonewall in New York as the start of the organized gay rights movement, but about 3 years before that, a police raid by the LAPD on this bar on New Year's Eve, going into 1967, led to some of the first organized action protests and a legal action, a court decision. It was one of the first US demonstrations and court actions asserting equal protection rights for gays and lesbians in this country. And so the preservation law in Los Angeles is pioneering, and LA is being on the forefront of the national gay rights movement, all exemplified in this local landmark designated in 2008. But we also have an active program in Los Angeles of historic districts, what we call historic preservation overlay zones. They feature in a chapter in the book. We have 35 of these HPOZs, as we call them, citywide, and I feature a cross-section of those in the book. And I think one thing that's interesting about our historic districts in LA, not necessarily true in every city, is that they are tremendously diverse. They have a higher share of a non-white population in the historic districts than the average share of persons of color throughout the rest of the city. And our income levels are actually lower in the HPOZs than the average income level in the rest of the city. But it's a very diverse group of historic districts. This is the Jefferson Park HPOZ, a wonderful neighborhood of craftsman bungalows from the early 20th century, a neighborhood that remains about 50% Latino, 35% African-American, and an example of how historic district status really has helped to knit together a sense of community in this neighborhood. I love this photo that Shafe took as well, because it shows how drought-tolerant landscaping, more important in LA than in Seattle, having this type of landscaping and sustainability features, how this can be inserted even within a historic district very sensitively. Our historic districts also show that historic preservation and density are not mutually exclusive. This is an image from our Lincoln Heights historic preservation overlay zone. And one thing I think that surprises a lot of people is that our historic districts are not high-rise Manhattan-style density, but we have a average residential density in our HPOZs that's 50% higher than what we have in the rest of the city, and actually higher than the citywide residential density in Boston, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. And this is a neighborhood, so Lincoln Heights has this sort of mixed livable density. You have here on this block a single-family home, a triplex in a Spanish colonial revival style, and then an apartment building in a prairie craftsman style, that all, different styles, different densities, but it kind of hangs together well in a, within a historic district. So, again, most of LA's historic districts have this. Some of them are single family neighborhoods. Most of them are a unique mix of this type. But I want to make sure I'm not painting an entirely rosy picture of historic preservation in LA. We have a lot of work to do in many areas. One of those I know we'll talk more about is around equity and inclusion in the historic preservation field. We've been working hard to enhance that in Los Angeles, but in many ways we're still falling short. Still the case that a disproportionately small number of our Local landmarks reflect associations with communities of color, only about less than 10%. Citywide, only about 4% of our designated landmarks reflect African American heritage, and we need to take a hard look at why that's the case. One of those that is designated, that's shown here, is the New Temple Missionary Baptist Church, best known for being the location of the recording of Aretha Franklin's Amazing Grace, the best-selling gospel album. The recording in this church was captured in a documentary that Sidney Pollack shot 50 years ago, just released in the last few years. One of a number of Black churches that are designated in Los Angeles, but we have much more to do. And we recently launched, in partnership with the Getty Conservation Institute, the African American Historic Places Project, Los Angeles, to begin to rectify some of these disparities of what gets designated and advance more nominations and deepen some of the work that we have done around African American heritage in the city. Some of that is around the development of frameworks for historic preservation, and what many of you who are in the field know are called historic context statements, which really help us understand the key themes and the forces that have shaped the growth and development of our cities. And we have prepared historic context for, and in partnership with, many of our diverse communities of the city, including an African American history context that I do use as kind of a jumping off point to talk about equity and inclusion in the book. The African American history context kind of starts with this map that I know many of you have seen, similar maps probably in Seattle and elsewhere. This is the redlining map of LA, and this was a matter of federal policy. The Federal Homeowner Loan Corporation, the HOLC, in the New Deal era prepared these maps, and the red on the maps were meant to be communities that were riskiest in terms of financing and lending. And that resulted in the systematic exclusion of communities of color from being able to access capital to purchase homes, and resulted in much of the wealth disparity that we still see endure to this day. And we also saw racially restrictive covenants during these same eras. That's the story that shapes much of our African American history context, but we also tell the story of efforts to break down those exclusionary practices. The home on the right is the Hattie McDaniel residence. Some of you may know her name as the Academy Award-winning actress in Gone with the Wind. And she joined with others in her community to hire the attorney at the lower left, Lauren Miller, to take on racially restrictive covenants systematically. The court challenge that ultimately led to the Shelley v. Kramer decision in 1948 that ruled at the US Supreme Court level that racially restrictive covenants were unenforceable. So that is kind of the beginning and one of many stories that we tell about places in Los Angeles that reflect the complexity of some of that history. We've prepared context with many other communities, 5 Asian American historic contexts in the city. This image reflects the Latino Los Angeles historic context. And the image in particular reflects the influence of Latinos on the visual arts, and particularly the muralist movement in Los Angeles. This is called the Great Wall of Los Angeles. It's one of the longest murals in the country. It is in the San Fernando Valley along the Tujunga flood control channel, completed over a decade-long period by a woman named Judy Baca, who worked with youth every summer in Los Angeles to really tell an alternative social history of Los Angeles. And as a result of our work on the historic context, the Great Wall is now listed in the National Register of Historic Places. But preservation in Los Angeles has also led the way in creating a downtown renaissance for our city, fueled by the power of adaptive reuse, converting historic buildings to newer purposes. This is the beautiful Art Deco Eastern Columbia building on downtown's Broadway, in the heart of our historic core in downtown. And the adaptive reuse ordinance that was passed in 1999 cleared away some of the previous zoning code impediments to converting historic buildings to housing. Previously, in particular, you would have had to provide multiple parking spaces per unit in historic buildings that couldn't accommodate that on site. And so the ordinance in 1999 really cleared the way for the development of more than 12,000 new downtown housing units in just over a decade in downtown LA. One of the examples I show in the book is the subway terminal building. I think even many Angelenos don't know that we had a small subway system developed prior to World War II in Los Angeles that terminated at this building that was built in 1925 in the heart of downtown. The building ultimately, it had been an office building. The office vacancy rate increased by the 1990s. The trains had stopped running in the 1950s. And the adaptive reuse ordinance allowed its conversion to a complex now called Metro 417, echoing its numerical address on Hill Street downtown, 277 spectacular loft-style apartment buildings, a lobby, obviously, that you couldn't build today with marble floors, and, stately columns, a coffered ceiling. And this is also an example of how historic preservation incentives, tax credits, such as the federal rehabilitation tax credit, combined with a state program that we have that's a property tax incentive program, how that can be combined to make adaptive reuse possible to create new housing in cities. And historic preservation also can help meet our affordable housing crisis. And we certainly have one in Los Angeles. I know you are facing many of the same challenges in Seattle as many coastal cities are. This is the Boyle Hotel project in Boyle Heights in downtown LA, dating from 1889 originally. I love this juxtaposition showing transit-oriented development of the 1880s and 1890s with our streetcar system. Well before there was a skyline in downtown Los Angeles, the same view with a new transit stop immediately across the street. And this was converted into, it was a hotel that was converted into 30 units of affordable housing in the historic building. In addition, that you can see attached as you look toward downtown, 21 new units in an addition. And again, a great example of how dedicated affordable housing with sensible additions, compatible additions, can be accommodated in our historic buildings. And preservation can also play a crucial role in addressing our climate challenge. This is showing some images in the Venice community, one of our coastal communities in Los Angeles. And while as preservationists, we're used to thinking about the bulldozer as the threat to our historic buildings, increasingly it's climate, extreme weather such as in LA, wildfires, flooding, our low-lying areas of the coastal communities that are at risk of inundation from sea level rise. This is a sea level rise map of what we're going to see in the coming decades in our Venice community, overlaid with some of our historic and cultural resources in the community, that we need to be thinking about this intersection of climate and cultural heritage. Increasingly, we're calling it climate heritage as a climate heritage network internationally. And we need to realize that to combat climate change as well, the greenest building is the one that's already built. And we need to preserve the materials and kind of inherent carbon that is in our existing buildings, as well as to make our existing buildings more energy efficient, since the existing buildings are responsible for about 40% of all carbon emissions. And the book also calls for what I term an approach we're calling people-centered preservation. Really trying to think about inclusion in the preservation field, to recognize that some of our traditional tools of historic preservation, the designation of buildings, aren't always sufficient to help communities protect what makes their cultural heritage unique. This is the community of Leimert Park, probably our preeminent African-American cultural center in Los Angeles. And historic designation doesn't always protect the cultural practices, the customs, the traditions, the longtime legacy businesses in a community that really make our communities distinctive. So we need to broaden in the preservation field the way that we are looking at historic preservation. Many cities such as San Francisco are looking at tools such as cultural districts and legacy business programs. And we are going down that path in Los Angeles as well, to really look at intangible heritage, the celebration and protection of customs and traditions, going beyond bricks and mortar in the way that we approach preservation. And finally, before we open it up to discussion, I just wanted to close with a little bit on Survey LA, our citywide historic resources survey that also kind of serves as a centerpiece of this book. A large part of the book captures this decade-long effort to take comprehensive stock of all of our historic resources. This was, again, a partnership with the Getty, the J. Paul Getty Trust, Getty Foundation, and Getty Conservation Institute. And we really had survey teams literally go down every street of Los Angeles, guided by a lot of research and historic context work that anchored much of this work, and also anchored in a very robust public participation program to tap into collective knowledge about places that are significant or may not be obvious to architectural historians in each community. All of this led to the creation of a citywide inventory that's online now called Historic Places LA at historicplacesla.org. And the basic premise is that historic preservation can only succeed in a city if we know what and where our historic resources are in the first place, so we can begin to have preservation information guide where we want to grow as a city and what it is we want to protect as we continue to grow and evolve. So the book just kind of closes, and really it's a significant portion of the book, with some of the interesting finds across the city from Survey LA. These are kind of hidden gems in every community of Los Angeles. And I think it's been a revelation even to Angelenos what each of our communities have. And just to give you a little visual taste of Los Angeles for those of you who haven't been there or want to get a sense of some of what we found very briefly. This is a residence in Boyle Heights from 1878 that was actually the home of the first Methodist minister of Chinese descent in the United States. And it's amazing that a Chinese American during a period in the late 19th century of Chinese exclusion and discrimination against Chinese Americans was able to own this home. It's a beautiful Queen Anne home as well architecturally, but very significant in the history of our Chinese American community in the city. The survey found really quirky and distinctive examples of architecture, including this campanile in the Hollywood Hills called High Tower that actually is an elevator tower serving a network of homes linked by pedestrian stairways and walkways in the Hollywood Hills, 1923. Examples of mid-century modernism, this sort of soaring A-frame chapel, kind of conveying the mid-century optimism, a sprawling Los Angeles in the 1950s, and many other examples. And again, this is just a tiny cross-section of over about 300 examples in the book, but just wanted to end with this one, to kind of have you think about layers of history as important to any city. And certainly it's important in our work in Los Angeles. This is a modest community of single-family homes near Leimert Park, the image I showed you earlier, off Crenshaw Boulevard in Los Angeles. And it's been largely an African-American majority neighborhood for the last 30 or 40 years. But this was a neighborhood that was a Japanese-American neighborhood significantly in the late 1940s, early 1950s, and 1960s as Japanese Americans came back to Los Angeles after the internment during World War II. And you can see kind of the layers of history, even as the demographics of the city have changed. The bonsai, Japanese American landscaping, and architectural influences still remain. And I think, this is, in many ways, the beauty of the work that we do in historic preservation, to be able to convey the nuances, the layers, the complexity of our history, to use that as we plan our city. And my hope is that the book, Preserving Los Angeles, will bring into focus for you a Los Angeles that may be surprising from the outside and change your views of what our city is, but even more so, perhaps being from Seattle or elsewhere, kind of point the way to how historic preservation can make a real difference in any city to address some of our urgent challenges of today. So I will stop there and look forward to the conversation.
Great. Thank you, Ken. That was fantastic. And I want to say that I'm just gonna, you see it in front of you, but like, here's the actual book. Both Jeff and I have a copy. It's a wonderful book. We really recommend it, and you'll get to learn more than what Ken has talked about today. You just got a taste of it, and the photographs from Stephen Schaefer are amazing. So highly recommend it. So Ken and I have known each other for many, many years, and the work that he and his team have done in the city of Los Angeles is pretty amazing, just given the size of it and the complexity of it. So I want to have some questions for Sarah and for Aaron, and I want to welcome Sarah. So thank you for joining us today, our Seattle's Historic Preservation Officer, and Jeff Murdock, my partner in advocacy here at Historic Seattle. So we're just gonna, we have some questions for Sarah and Ken. It's gonna kind of expand on some of what you've already heard. And then we want to open it up to the audience because I can already see in the chat, there's some really good questions there. We want to make sure that we have time for that. So first question is about housing and density. So the topic of housing and density is very pertinent in Los Angeles, Seattle, and other West Coast cities. Historic neighborhoods and buildings are part of the solution to housing issues, but preservation is often pitted against housing as if they are mutually exclusive. So this question was for both of you. How do we change this narrative of either or and better communicate the benefits of preservation in increasing housing supply and preserving places and spaces important to people who live in our cities?
Sarah, do you want to start on this one?
Sure, happy to. That's a really good question, and we think about it a lot in the city's historic preservation program. So I think preserving the places and spaces that are important to all communities, it supports livability, connection, and belonging. And I think we need to better communicate why we do this work. And I think we also need to involve community in decision-making. When decision-making about preservation-related issues seems remote, it gives people give space to people with negative ideas to define our work. So we need to better define our work ourselves. And I think that we also need to tell the story about that the city has a long, city of Seattle has a long history of housing and preservation working together towards common goals. And Ken mentioned the rehabilitation tax credits, and we have a lot of projects over the last several decades that have been successful because of those incentives. And I'm seeing now projects like such as the Leamington Pacific Apartments downtown, and the Louise apartments in the CID, and building number 9 in Sandpoint Naval Historic District that are still using those incentives to create more housing and affordable housing. We have a lot of other great examples of rehabilitation projects and new construction and infill too. Recently, I like the Al Chief Seattle Club in Pioneer Square, I think is a great example of infill, compatible infill in our historic district that's created more housing. And I think finally that the one piece that is really important to point out, particular to Seattle, is that we only have about a half of a percent of our building stock is designated as a landmark or within a historic district. And that's according to the National Trust Reurbanism Initiative. And so I think we need to use more data when we're talking about preservation tools and how many units we've created. I think that just shows that it's such a limited area of the city that we're talking about, but it has such a big impact. It's not stopping housing from being developed.
Yeah, that's a great point, Sarah. And I think something, we often cite the statistics in Los Angeles. It's a higher percentage in Los Angeles. I think between our historic districts and individual landmarks, we're about 2.5% of the city has historic designation. But again, I often point out that leaves 97.5% of the city that doesn't have that type of historic preservation regulatory review, where growth and development, new housing opportunity can happen. But I think this is a really important issue, especially for cities like ours on the coast, where we have significant housing crises. Obviously large unhoused population, housing prices that are some of the highest in the country. I mean, the housing agenda really is front and center in major cities. And I've tried to address some of this in the book and really point to examples of, again, just the success of adaptive reuse in creating new housing supply. And as that ordinance went in, it was representing a very high percentage of our new housing production in the city during the initial years that was in place. And so that is a big part of the solution in terms of creating new housing supply. And then just examples of how you compare historic preservation with opportunities to create dedicated affordable housing, such as the Boyle Hotel that I pointed out. We have an example in the book of a YMCA building originally designed by the pioneering African-American architect Paul Revere Williams that has also been converted to affordable housing. And again, it was a YMCA serving the African-American community. It served as a community center. It's now a community center in a very different way as kind of an anchor affordable housing project, again, with a new addition associated with it. Again, many of these are using historic preservation incentives in addition to housing tax credits and housing incentives to make this all possible. And I think we've had to kind of sort through some of the misperceptions about historic preservation. There's a large what's called YIMBY movement in California, and I think you're starting to see that in Washington as well, kind of yes in my backyard, which I was kind of heartened by initially, because I think we do need to kind of overcome knee-jerk opposition to new housing opportunity. But at times, some YIMBY advocates have kind of pigeonholed historic preservation as more of the problem than the solution. And I think we need to kind of get out of that either or kind of mentality and really look at ways that we can collaborate on a common agenda and have historic preservation be part of the solution. One of those areas I would just mention also is accessory dwelling units, or ADUs. And we, in part because of some state legislation in California that really liberalized ADUs in single family zones, we saw almost 300 new ADUs last year in our historic districts, in our 35 historic preservation overlay zones. And we are not giving those the same design review that we were able to give. We would give in the past. We have to apply only very kind of fixed and quantifiable standards based on what state law allows. But we have seen sensitive insertions of new housing units in historic districts in ways that have not been, by and large, detrimental to those districts. So I think as a preservation community, we also have to be open to accepting that type of sensible evolution in kind of reconciling the housing agenda with the historic preservation agenda.
Great, thank you both on that really thoughtful responses to this issue, which we will, I think Historic Seattle, we're going to visit the housing issue specifically probably later this year in another program. So stay tuned on that. So the next question is, many successful preservation projects involve adaptive reuse, rehabilitating and converting older buildings into new uses, such as a former warehouse into housing, office, or hotel. And Ken, I know you started talking about this already. What has the impact of the adaptive reuse ordinance been in LA, not just downtown, but in other neighborhoods? And how is the ordinance evolving to better address current goals and policies of the city?
Yeah, I spoke a bit about the impact downtown. I mean, I think over 12,000 housing units in a relatively short period of time. And that had a tremendous impact on downtown. When in 1999, our downtown was a kind of roll up the sidewalks at 5 p.m. Urban center, unfortunately. We had the civic center, it was a financial center, but no one thought anyone would want to live in the heart of downtown. And there was real skepticism that the adaptive reuse ordinance would have a significant impact. But I think the impact of the ordinance, again, by waiving some of the zoning incentives, making it easier to convert these buildings, it showed that people did want to live downtown, and especially were attracted to some of the unique residential architecture that we have downtown. And that in turn really created a residential base that then brought in new development of additional residential construction, a real restaurant boom, creating a nightlife for downtown that had not existed. So it really was historic preservation that created economic regeneration and also created the conditions for a more significant urban residential center in the heart of our city. But I think what we're seeing now is a couple things. One is beyond downtown, we had only targeted areas of the city where the kind of by right development of residential was allowed. In most areas of the city, adaptive reuse would still require a public hearing before a zoning administrator, additional environmental review, a lot of process and time and money for an applicant. So we didn't see as much adaptive reuse in some of the outlying areas of the city. We did in downtown Hollywood and a few other areas. And now we've seen, as a result of COVID, really a changed commercial office building landscape and a changed mentality about how we work as a society. And so we have office buildings that are sitting, if not vacant, significantly underutilized. We have vacancy rates over 20% in most of our commercial districts, which we've never had to that extent. And so we want to update the adaptive reuse ordinance. So later this month, we are planning to release a set of proposed amendments that would extend some of these incentives truly citywide, that you would be able to do these conversions without public hearings. We would bring in much younger buildings. The current ordinance cuts off in 1974 as a date of construction. We want to create a rolling date so it always kind of updates and bring in the buildings of the 80s and 90s and even possibly more recent buildings, and really extend this incentive citywide as a way of addressing our post-COVID recovery, revitalize commercial districts, and meet the climate challenge as well that I already referenced.
Great, thank you, Ken. And definitely we look forward to seeing the version 2.0 of the ordinance, I think. So Sarah, for you, related to adaptive use, do you think an adaptive reuse ordinance in Seattle would help encourage developers to choose preservation over redevelopment? And please share with us how adaptive reuse contributes to reducing climate impacts and increasing resiliency of older buildings.
So, Seattle definitely has different issues and different building types from LA, but one thing that I think a lot about is how our regulations here in Seattle and our building code focus primarily on supporting new construction. So it certainly would be helpful to have specific regulatory support for the adaptive reuse of existing buildings. The city is currently looking at the feasibility of converting office buildings to housing, specifically in downtown. And just as a part of reimagining and revitalizing downtown. So our zoning code does allow landmarks as an incentive through an administrative conditional use permit to convert to a use that isn't necessarily allowed in a zone. So we already have that tool throughout the city, and we have some examples of buildings that have used that tool to provide more housing, the Queen Anne Exchange, the Pacific Telegraph and Telephone Company building that have used that tool. So I think it definitely, when you have those tools, it works. And then thinking about climate goals, and we really need to move beyond just focusing on operational energy improvements and expand our focus to the impacts of embodied energy. And Ken alluded to that earlier. We really need to think about embodied energy as a part of the calculation and value of existing buildings, so that reusing existing buildings clearly saves energy and reduces carbon. So by preventing demolition, that's preventing buildings going to the landfill. And existing buildings can be more efficient in their use of energy, and I think we can show that is possible. And then the other thought I had was that adaptive reuse is definitely more labor intensive, but it's far less material intensive. And this really goes to supporting local craftspeople, creation of jobs, and the use of local resources. And in terms of the last point I'll make is that in terms of resilience, the more adaptive reuse of these historic buildings and older buildings that we have, I think a lot about resilience in terms of seismic resilience. And I think that's another focus that we could have in an adaptive reuse ordinance, is really focusing on life safety and resilience in that way.
Thank you, Sarah. I think, we talk about adaptive reuse, but in both cities, it's been going on for a long time. So it's not anything new. I want people to know that. And it is great that one of the incentives for landmarks here in Seattle is allowing it to be used in a way it might otherwise not be. So great, thank you. Let's see. So third question is, can each of you speak to how your programs center diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how this work grows out of expanded historic context statements, survey and inventory, and strategies for addressing ethnic and cultural themes to move beyond architectural significance?
Yeah, I can start. I mean, I think I alluded to this. We've been trying to be very intentional about how we approach this and using historic context as a way of advancing some of this work around equity and inclusion. And many of the frameworks that we've created through Survey LA have had a significant impact as community members have been able to utilize that to follow up and achieve historic designation of many of these sites that we were able to highlight, to kind of do some of the upfront work on the key themes to establish significance, and then allow individual designations to then to come in under that in many ways. And some of the partnerships that we've developed and the working relationships have helped to advance a great deal of this work. I referenced the African American Historic Places project, the partnership with Getty that we're now working on. I think the idea there is to, again, advance many more designations of African American heritage sites, to really broaden and deepen the work that we did on the African American history historic context, to enable us to do much more community engagement and bring in themes that weren't fully developed in the initial document that was about a one-year effort. But even beyond that, to kind of look at some of these less traditional tools that I alluded to around legacy businesses, cultural districts, and develop some cultural preservation strategies in partnership with some of our historically African American neighborhoods of the city, to kind of look at these non-traditional tools and how we implement them moving forward, and really to kind of look at all of our preservation policies and practices as well through an anti-racist lens, to look at, are we putting in place impediments that make it difficult for communities to participate in our processes, whether it's historic designation or to comply with our design guidelines, really taking a careful look at all of that, that type of work. And then finally, I think, and I was pleased you began with a land acknowledgement. We are realizing we have not addressed the indigenous history of our community and of our various communities in any type of concerted way. We are now beginning an indigenous peoples historic context as well, which is work that is long overdue in our city to lay the groundwork for inclusion of many of those original communities of our region.
Thanks, Kim. Sarah, how about you?
Yeah, so I just keep going back to the why of what we do this. It's to, as I said before, preserving the places and spaces that are important to all communities. And knowing that preservation has historically focused on architectural significance, and that focus might not be the best fit for supporting a preservation of what is important to all communities. So we need to find more ways of recognizing history and telling history that is accessible and inclusive. And for us, the collaboration, feedback, and support from Four Cultures Beyond Integrity has been a really positive influence in keeping us focused and centering race in the work we do. And I just want to give kudos to my staff that we're constantly challenging each other in this way. And we're trying to challenge each other to make that transformational change where we have the power and opportunity to do that. And I think those opportunities are in our business practices, our board recruitment and membership. They're the decision makers. Hiring diverse staff, language access is really important to us. And we've put especially during COVID, we put a lot of time and energy into ensuring language access. So that's interpretation, translation, beyond. And then people-centered storytelling and asking questions that really prompt the shift from the dominant culture focus to including history of all communities. So we're doing that in some kind of focused ways. One is the Seattle History Project, which we've collaborated with our communications team on, and that's really supporting community and telling their own stories. So we pay community to tell their stories instead of assuming they'll give us that time. And then, as I said, language access and our collaboration with the community liaison program in our department. We're in the Department of Neighborhoods, and we have a program that supports community experts, kind of building capacity and access within the community. And so we've collaborated with those folks on updating design guidelines with community input and feedback. And that's really just a part of relationship building too, which is an ongoing process, but it's really important in lifting community voices and their priorities in our work. And then another thing we're working on right now is working on the comprehensive plan update. And we have a project where we're compensating community history experts that are helping us tell a more complete history of Seattle in our environmental impact statement. And it just really, for me, the priority is to help communities identify the places and spaces that are important to them. And kind of getting back to the your question of context statements and survey projects, we haven't had a lot of resources to do that work, especially in the last 10 years. But we have big plans to try to do some of that work that centers the least represented members of our community, and instead of just being neighborhood focused or geographic focused, focus on communities of color and underrepresented communities, as well as intersectional identities that cut across many communities. And this work, what we're hoping to do is to really focus on what community finds significant, not just what architectural historians find important. And we have some plans for how we're going to implement that will hopefully serve as a future model for survey and inventory work that we do in the city.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. I know that takes resources to do that. So if there's any way the public can help have the city leaders put more on your budget, let us know. Yeah. Well, thank you both. These are the questions that we had for you, but there are quite a few questions in the chat. And since we only have about 5 minutes left, we're not going to be able to get through all of them. So we're going to ask some of them, and maybe we can respond to some of them offline. So one was a question early on, Ken, because your LA's historic districts are called overlay zones, which I know is a planning term. Can you just sort of define that better. And the question was, is it more difficult to do preservation outside of these overlay zones?
Yeah, I mean, that is really what we call our historic districts. It kind of conveys that this is overlaid. It's part of the zoning designation of any property. So there's actually an indication on the zone. If you look at what the zoning is that controls land use, it includes a little suffix that says HPOZ, Historic Preservation Overlay Zone, that's sort of laid on top of the base zoning of the property. And so, but I think in most cities, that's just generically called a historic district. And that is probably our most rigorous form of kind of preservation regulatory review. And we have a volunteer board that helps the city actually oversee our HPOZs. I think you have a similar system in Seattle, as I call it. I think our two cities are among the few in that regard that have this sort of decentralized system of local historic district boards. But that is the highest level of review in a way. We have our local historic cultural monuments, and then we have properties that are identified as significant through our historic resources survey.
Great, thanks, Ken. I was talking about this, we could spend an hour on each one of these topics. It's kind of crazy. So another question is, what's the public transportation availability in and close by most of these neighborhoods, especially considering the diversity? Is there also diversity in income?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there is tremendous diversity in income as well. Many of the historic neighborhoods are now much better served by public transit. We've had a significant investment in our rail system in the city over the last quarter century, and we're taxing ourselves with a sales tax measure in order to continue the build out of that system. So these are now neighborhoods. Many of them are closer in, but they really are throughout the city. So it varies quite a bit. Some are better served by transit than others. But again, there is a high percentage of these neighborhoods are below our citywide median in income. And what's interesting is the historic district status. There was concern in some of those areas whether there would be, to use the G word, gentrification, whether there would be displacement when some of those neighborhoods were designated. And by and large, the income levels have perhaps modestly increased, but there has not been kind of widespread change in that way or significant residential displacement as a result of some of those designations.
Thanks. Okay, so we have a meaty question from Daniel Ronan. Hi, Daniel. Okay, it says, thank you for your presentation. Can you speak to the Mills Act and the implications for preservation on your work in LA and California? Do that in 2 minutes.
Really quickly, the Mills Act is our major financial incentive for preservation at the local level. It's a property tax incentive enabled by a state law that's implemented by local governments. We work with our county assessor's office, which handles property taxes. And it's a contract, a voluntary contract that owners can enter into to result in an alternative assessment formula on their property taxes, and then putting the savings from the property taxes back into ongoing substantial rehabilitation work on their properties. It's a big topic. It's been, I think, very successful by and large. We have almost 1,000 properties in our Mills Act program in Los Angeles. Over the last couple of years, we've been actually going through an assessment, kind of a reassessment of that program to, again, really look at who is benefiting from the program. Can we enhance some of the equity outcomes in terms of who is benefiting? We want to kind of sharpen the focus of the program on housing and affordable housing. So we are coming back to our city council later this year with some recommendations on ways to enhance that program moving forward now that it's been in place for about a quarter century. Oh, you're muted, Eugenia.
I know we're at 1 o'clock, but I'm going to squeeze in one more question
Okay.
because it's about incentives, more about more incentives. Are incentives used in LA to help entice homeowners and stakeholders? So I know you just talked about the Mills Act. Are there other incentives?
Yeah, I think the Mills Act is probably has the most impact because often it often surprises people. The majority of homeowners actually are in support of their property being designated as a local landmark or historic cultural monument, and the major reason for that is they are motivated to qualify for the Mills Act. It has to be a designated property either individually or part of one of our historic districts. So that is a great motivation that gets buy-in to our local program. That's actually a question right now. There's an active debate as we reform the Mills Act program. should we keep that tie in place? There's some who want to broaden the Mills Act incentive to properties that may not have formal designation as a way of addressing equity. And I think there's a lively debate as to whether that would, in fact, undercut the enticement, as the questioner put it, in terms of tying the incentive to formal designation, or whether we want to be more inclusive of properties that don't have formal designation.
Okay, last thing. So Sarah, any thoughts about incentives here in Seattle that are available to property owners?
Well, our major incentive is the special tax valuation, which if a property owner puts in at least 25% of their improvement value in a rehabilitation project, they can deduct the rehabilitation expenditures from the overall assessed value for a period of 10 years. And that's our primary incentive, and a lot of folks take advantage of that. A lot of bigger projects, I think that the challenge with it is that it's not as useful to smaller property owners who aren't as needing to invest as much into their rehabilitation projects, but it is used by some smaller property owners, single family homeowners, although we have very few, we don't really have any single family home historic districts here in Seattle. So that isn't, the folks who can take advantage of it usually do. And there's a smaller number of those homeowners that do.
Great. Well, we are out of time. I want to thank you both, Ken and Sarah, for joining us today. Again, I think you have links to more information about the book and also City of LA's program. And we can also have information about the City of Seattle's program. And yeah, I think Evan said, anything else? We're going to follow up with an email as well related to more information.
Yeah, everybody who registered for this program will be getting a follow-up email with links to the book and the presentation. So thank you all again. Thank you, Ken, Sarah, Eugenia, Jeff. This has been really fun.
Thank you.
Well, my pleasure. It's great to be with you.
Okay.
Thank
Thanks.
you both.
Take care. Bye.